engineer, did a lot of work on forgings, flight controls, and hydraulics, and worked my way up, finally retired as a manager, chief of systems on the 737 new generation. And part of my job, particularly towards the end, was working accident investigations. We had a couple of accident investigations. And I retired in '95 with a big brain drain, and then hired back in. They hired me back in at consulting for 2 years, and most of the consulting that I did was working with the NTSB on a couple of different accidents that we had. And one of the things when you're working on forensic analysis of broken parts and things like that, you're always looking at how did it get there. With my background in forgings and design and things like that, that's the reason I was put in that particular position by Boeing. One of the things you do is you see something and you say, well, that's obvious. Well, no, you can't quit looking. What's obvious may not be the actual cause. You've got to keep looking, have an open mind, come up with all of the different scenarios that might occur, and then, like you're taking the old geometry class back in high school, you start eliminating those, and pretty soon you get down to what it is that you're looking for. And so it's really important that just because something is obvious, just because something has been written down a lot of times, different mindset when you have the background that I have is keep looking, is there another explanation? And so looking at these 1883 over 82 shield nickels. Next slide, please. You take a look at it. There's oh, there it is. There it is. You can see that too. And I got to looking at this, and I said, they obviously didn't take a 82 die and erase it because there's no hole there, no big lump there. So somehow or another, they got that 2 on there, and it's real shallow. So I took a 1882 proof picture and I did a superimposing, and you can see that what you see in there is the very high points. And what that amounts to is it's the deepest part of the die. In other words, what I'm seeing there was what was in the bottom of the date punch. How do you get that to the surface? Because it's obvious up on the surface on the new die. Well, you can either repunch it. Of course, if you repunch it, you're liable to see different kinds of, more of the die. Why see a lot of die here and almost none there? The other explanation that made a lot more sense to me was you start to shave the die off. You cut the die off until you get down to where the bottom of the date is now up on the surface. Now you got a blank, and you start with a new blank, and you can rehub the thing and come up, have a new die, put the new date on it, and now you've got just those remnants underneath. So that was the 301. Next. Took a look, there's the 1882, and that's what I was doing the overlays with. Next. And here's the one that's over there. Again, it's a different one. But again, and when you do an overlay, what you're seeing is, again, the very deepest part of the die. Same pattern. Next. The very next one, this is the 303. You can see the foot of a 2 in here. This is an old die, it's cracked. Most of them you can see a little bit of an 8 in here, and you can see a big part of the foot. Again, it fits perfectly. It's, again, same thing. It's what was in the deepest part of the date punch, been brought to the surface. Next. Same routine with the 304. They almost got it cleaned off, but there was just a little bit left. Again, it's the very deepest part of the die, very high part there. Same pattern. So it became real clear to me that these were worn dies, or new dies, worn dies. What difference does it make? But they shaved them off, used that as a die blank, annealed it, and rehubbed it, put a new date on it. So that's how this 1883/82 came about. Next. I looked at some of the others of the overdates, and Ken Hill discovered this particular coin. It's called a 305, FS 305 in cherry pickers. And one of the guys, I don't remember which one, that there's two authors for the cherry pickers, looked at that and says, well, that's obviously, again, obvious, a little bit of the one. So that's an overdate. That's an 83. Well, the truth is that's just a die chip. I never have figured out what that is. Right in there, those are scratches in the die. So PCGS at one time was certifying this as an 83/82. They now call it an overdate because I think someone else figured out it's not really an 83/82. Or vice versa. Next. There is another coin that's called a repunch date, the FS 311. They call it an RPD. But if you look at this RPD, the one shows pretty good. Some of them show a little bit of the 2 in here, but most of them you can only see a little bit of a 1. And this particular coin I had, and I sold it to Ken, Tom Crabtree, put it in his PCGS registry set. If you look at this coin, the 1 on the 1883 die is flat across here. If you look at the 82, that's got a hump on right there. And you see a hump. And so that tells me that this coin is not an RPD. This is a same pattern as 83/82. That's what this coin is. Although in cherry pickers, it's called an RPD. Next. So if you take a look at it and say, well, these coins were made from dies, I took a look at the dies, and here's just a picture of a standard die. They're just round, they're put in there. Next. And if you look at that 1883/82, I was curious about how much they had to take off to grind the thing down. And if you look at it, the devices, the shield and all of the other things, that hole is about 8 thousandths deep. The date is only about 6 thousandths deep. And if you think about this a little bit, if they cut that off and leave 2 thousandths, that what's left in there is about the equivalent of one hubbing. And so they not only, if they start to salvage dies, if they do this and they're trying very close to leave as much as this as they can, and they were leaving like 1 to 2 10,000ths of an inch of material, or a hole there that left 1 to 2 10,000ths of the remnants, it turns out that's enough to see. So it was pretty obvious to me that, obvious again, pretty clear to me that they were trying to salvage as much as they could, salvage as much of that. And incidentally, the first time you take a die and you hub it, there's no index marks on it. You can hub it any old way and it works. After that, you anneal it, come back and hub it again, anneal it. Now you've got an impression and you can line the die up, the hub up with that impression and keep doing it. If they don't get it quite lined up, you get double dies and other little things like that. So at least on the 1883/82, this is what they did. It's pretty clear. They didn't try to erase anything and leave a big hole. They were doing that. Next. So apparently, when they tried to clean it off, they would leave just a tiny bit of the date in there. This one doesn't show the hole there where the devices were, but it's pretty easy just to grind the thing off. why start standard shop practice? Why start with expensive tool steel, turn it down, make a die, when you can take a used die that's not broken and come up with a new blank? Next. So I got to looking at different overdates. It's pretty obvious, pretty clear that's what was happening with the 1883 over 82. And so I took a look at some of the real early dates, and it doesn't show here too well, but if you look at some of the real early dies, they were hand engraving the date in there, and you get some overdates there. Well, it's clear that what they did is they had, in this case, a 1797 die, the year changed, and they decided to put a new date on it, and they just engraved over the top of it. Now, the underdate and the overdate is about the same height. So, next. If you take a look at the next batch of coins, you can see that the underdate is, like I say, that's only about 2 to 3 10,000ths, 1 to 3 10,000ths of an inch, and that's about 6 thousandths of an inch. And so it's clear to me that they weren't hand engraving this, they were punching these dates in. Next.
What's the 8 looked like it had a 1 in it on the previous slide.
You can back up.
That 8 looks like there's...
I think that's just a die crack. If you look...
No, on the inside, on the O.
Oh,
yeah,
in there?
and down below.
It is. It's part of the 1. You see how far out, see how far offset the 6
okay.
is?
Gotcha.
The whole date. In this middle series, as I'm going to call it, they would make a die without the date so they could use the same undated hub year after year. So they would make a die without a date, and then they would take a date punch and then punch the thing in. And people would say, well, they'd hit it with a hammer or something like that. It turns out, if you're trying to hit it with a hammer, which I've read many times, you'll never get the same depth every time. So they had like a screw press or some other kind of device that they could put that date punch in there and go down to the same depth each and every time. So, and in this case, the old die, the date was over here, and they ground it off. They didn't get it completely cleaned off. In the new die, they put the date in a different place. Next. And this occurred repeatedly over and over. You can see a little bit of the 1 there. Here they got, it happens that they were pretty much in the same place, just rotated a little bit. Next. And then there's the next group of overdates is these dates. It turns out that the date was in the hub. They started putting the date in the hub, and they used 2 different hubs. They used a 1918 hub over a 1917 hub. Again, same thing happened on 41, 42, and the dimes. The date's in the hub. Next. You can't see it here, but it's the 18 over 17 standing Liberty quarter. Next. But when you look at punched in mint marks, here you can see it's a totally different kind of a thing. It's clear that these can readily be punched in. And considering that we see so many repunched mint marks where they're slightly offset, we see different where the punch might have bounced. They very well could have used a hammer to drive these in because they're not all the same depth. Again, they could have used some kind of a press. Who's to say? There's no record for that. So the repunched mint marks appear totally different than quote, quote, RPD coins. Next. So the other thing I got to noticing is when I looked at all of these Shield nickels in particular, the underdate was always the same date or 1 date earlier, 1 year earlier. And I looked at some of the hubs. If you look at them, the underdate, which is slightly shallower than the overdate, says that they used a 1817 hub, and then they used an 18 hub. So did they deliberately have a die that was partly hubbed, and the year came along and they switched hubs on them? Did they do it deliberately? Who knows? There's no records. But if you looking at other coins, it said if these shield nickels are all out of salvage dies, then what about some of the other varieties? Well, you can see that's just a die chip, but you can see a little part of the 7 sticking up here, and that's a 58 over 57. Next. Look at another series. Here's the same sort of thing. It's a 7 over a 7 quarters. Next. This is an interesting one, an Indian head penny. It's called a repunch date. But if you notice, it's like a couple of horns coming up here, and that's there. If you had a punch and you tried to punch that in so that that went down, but that didn't punch on the top, the punch would have to be tilted. If it was tilted, you'd see a big hole down here. You don't see it. So this is not a repunch date. This one is a real good example of a salvage die. And you look at it and say, well, how come these underdigits are kind of inconsistent? Well, as the die is being used and the die wears, the bottom of the cavity is going to wear in different patterns, and so you're going to get a different remnant when you take it off. Next. Here's another good example. And this happens to be a 3-cent nickel. Again, the underdate is just barely there. Next. And so, before we get into this one, so in summary, what it boils down to is there's a period where they pretty much hand-made the dies and did the engraving by hand. And then there's another, as the techniques improved for minting coins, they started hubbing dies without the date on the hub, and then punching the date in by some means. And then they started putting the dates on the hubs. And then so you have basically 3 different kinds of overdates. And the ones that we're looking at here are the ones in shield nickels, and it turns out if you look at all these other pennies, quarters, halves, same process. The mint, instead of taking a die that was showing a lot of wear, instead of just throwing that valuable piece of tool steel away, they would grind it off, try to grind just the date off, leave some of the devices as an indexing, and they did it on all the series, not just shield nickels. So that's when you read RPDs, that's come from guys many years ago looked at it and says, well, that was a repunch date. Well, there you are, it's obvious. But there's no records, there's no way to prove this. But if you take a look at all of these RPDs and start looking at these RPDs, an awful lot of them can't be made with a punch. But you know, I took a piece of clay one time and started trying to duplicate some of this stuff. You can't do it. So there's little doubt that most RPDs, there may be some real RPDs during that time period, and there probably are. I don't know, but the absolute lion's share of repunch dates within that time period, probably 18, 20, or 30, or somewhere in there, up to about, well, during the Buffalo nickel days, they started putting the, in fact, sometime during the V nickels, they started putting the dates, or at least part of the date, in the die, in the hub, rather, excuse me. So RPDs are not RPDs. They're created by salvaging reclaimed dyes.
Human error.
Pardon?
Human error.
No, it's deliberate. They're trying to save that material. Let's face it, you can take a piece of bar stock, you can machine it round, and you can anneal it, and you can hub it, and then you can hub it, and anneal it, and hub it.
Yeah, you
Or,
can only do it for so long, though.
yeah, and then the dye work hardens. And but if you have a dye that's made 20, 30,000 coins or whatever, and the devices are getting fuzzy, why throw that piece of material away? Grind it off. Look at all the material and work that you saved getting back to having a new dye blank that's even partly hubbed. So the evidence says that most RPDs are not RPDs. They evolved from salvage dyes within that time period when they were making those dyes without dates and punching them in. While I was doing my looking at shield nickels and all, I ran into another little thing I thought you guys would find interesting. But this is the FS301, and you can just barely see the 2 there. And if you look at some of the other part of the coin, there's no crack over here. And you just barely see that. Next die, please. And then, turns out, with a real heavy crack, you can see the 2 quite clear. You go to looking at some examples of this, and I think there's one more. Go to looking at some examples of this, and this die finally broke completely over here. And if you see how that is higher than that, it's kind of an interesting thing that particularly they started making the shield nickels, the second time they used nickel, and it's all hard, they cracked and broke an awful lot of dies. And when the die splits and cracks, the pressure on the face of the die redistributes. And some of these little fine features start to come out a lot stronger. I thought it was real interesting that sometimes the new strikes wouldn't show a fine feature. The old strikes, after the die is cracked and broken a little bit, pressure redistributed, and that feature comes up. So anyway, that's the end of my pitch. Is there any questions, comments?